Hey guys, Danny Johnson here, and today we're going to be installing this 26 spline input shaft on our t-56 transmission. So the 26 splines refers to how many teeth or splines are on the input shaft, and that has to match the clutch. So the factory 0304 Cobra came with a 10 spline shaft. We have a kit here, a Shim kit for the input shaft, and this one actually did not even work, as you'll see later in the video, but that might just depend on the particular shaft that I had compared to one that you might have. So that was the part number at least that I bought in a kit. So we're going to go ahead and install this input shaft, but my advice would be first, if you have the shaft free like we do, use it as an alignment tool. As you can see, the 26 spline have to go into the clutch, and this is a twin disc, so both of those clutch discs need to be lined up. And so when installing this on the car, it works a lot better than the plastic one. As you can see, the plastic one would strip as you clock both of those clutch discs together, especially with a twin disc like this one. So there's nothing better than using this input shaft. You're going to know for a fact it's going to fit. We'll also be using a dial indicator as well as digital calipers, and I'll put links in the description where you can get these. They're very necessary for this job. Now, some other things to mention is the 26 spline input shaft has to be for the 0304 Cobra T56. The T56 Magnum is actually a TR6060, and so the gears will not line up right. So this is a 31 tooth gear, 26 spline input shaft. And so there are some companies that make these, but the Tremec ones are no longer made. So that's something to know when we're upgrading from 10 splines to 26 splines. And again, this is the part number for the Shim kit, but it was not very useful in my case. So whether you decide to buy it or not, you'll see what I did later in the video in order to make it work. But that's entirely up to you. We will be removing all of these bolts here to get this front cover off. But before that, I wanted to get some factory specs here. So basically what I wanted to do was rotate this input shaft and get an idea of how freely it spins. Now, my car has 44,000 miles on it. It hasn't had hard miles, but it does make 600 horsepower. And in the end, you can see we have it spinning. This is the 26 spline shaft now. We have it spinning pretty much the same rate. And so there was something that I was going to do in order to get an actual reading.
So I wrapped electrical tape around the input shaft snout 5 times. The reason I went with 5 is because it was the perfect size for this bolt biter, which would be a 19 or a 3/4. And this has excellent grip on it. So I do not want to scar the input shaft, but I needed a way to get some bite on this to turn it. So there we are as we're seated here. Now I had a way of putting the socket on here, and I'm going to be able to turn this and get an inch-pound rating of how much force it takes to turn this. I'm going to then compare that to my 26 spline input shaft when it's installed. It is turning the counter shaft, so you're gear on gear. I'm not getting a preload on the bearing. I'm getting an overall measure from the stock input shaft and comparing it to when the 26 spline input shaft is installed to see if I have that same amount of friction. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and turn this, and it has a dial on it. And so this will record how much force it takes to turn it. It probably won't be much. There's no preload on the bearing. But what I want to do is compare that to the new input shaft when it's installed. And so for example, if we got maybe 1 inch-pound out of this, and then I put the new bearing in and I'm getting more, then I know the bearing's too tight. So just to know what factory is, we're going to go ahead and give this a few spins. Now on this, you do have to turn it. It measures this perfectly on this accuracy. You have to be right here where you're pushing. We're going to go ahead and spin this. Okay. I'm catching it on the down turn. But basically, as I turn it, that's the measurement that I'm getting, is how much force it takes to turn it. And as you see, it's pretty much
1/2 of an inch-pound. Next, I wanted to get a factory end play reading, and so what I came up with was a straight edge, because you may know the transmission is aluminum, so the magnet that I have for my dial indicator base will not work. So I basically just took this straight edge, I drilled a hole in it. It already had a hole in one of the sides here, and then I just bolted it to the case and to get it nice and firm. Now I could mount my base to the dial indicator that I bought, and I'll put links to those in the description as well if you want to see which ones I have here that I'm using. And so this is magnetic, so it locked on there really well, and we have a good way to measure our end play, which is going to be the forward and backward motion. And they do also in the T-56 manual say to do this with the transmission vertical, where the input shaft is hanging down, which is not really too possible. But as you can see, we're getting about 1,000th of movement on here, and so the spec is 0 to 2,000ths. That's where they would like to see it. And so this is looking pretty good for factory, and just wanted to have that to compare the new one to. Now it's a good idea to do a new retainer sleeve as well, and so if you are doing that, you want to go put it in the freezer and get it really cold. It's going to help it drop down into place, because this is a press-in item, so you freeze this one, it drops in a little bit easier for you, so make sure you go do that now. We'll be using a 15mm socket to get these cover bolts off, and so there are 11 of them. And their factory spec is 26 to 30 foot-pounds on install, but we're going to be taking this first section here of the cover. That's where it's going to separate. So you want the transmission elevated behind it so it can come off freely, and so we're going to go ahead and remove these. So with these 11 bolts out of the way, you can clean the Loctite and everything off of them too once they're off. Now we're going to have somebody else, this is Justin SVT helping me, he's going to hold that input shaft in place. We'll give it a few light taps here with a mallet. Also, there is a pry spot on this, but remember we're dealing with aluminum, so be very careful. So you can get a pry bar in here and just give it a little bit of a nudge. So we're going to go ahead and separate this slightly here, and as it starts to come apart, again, hold that input shaft in place. And you can even do this with the transmission vertical. I think that's how they intend for it, but as long as you have it elevated at an angle, we'll probably be okay. Up here at the top, you have your guide pins, so just look at those and make sure that they're still going where they should. Now, as we remove the input shaft, the gear with the input shaft and the counter shaft are meshed together, so it's a little difficult. It doesn't pull just straight out. Sometimes you have to rotate it slightly and work your way out. And you also want to put your fingers behind the input shaft and hold the blocker ring in place. So as you can see, I'm holding it with my right hand while wiggling this out and slightly turning it, and you'll be able to lift it upward and out of here. But it is a little tricky at first, so just make sure that nothing's going to fall out. We're going to hold this blocker ring here and just very gently walk this input shaft out of here. Now, as soon as that's removed, you want to really watch this blocker ring. Okay, as you see, I'm going to pull it out and show you. It is clocked, so it only goes in one way, but you have the snap ring for the synchronizer for third and fourth that's going through here, and you do not want that to pop out. Okay, so be very careful with this. Keep this in place, and this is why they recommend this transmission job being done with a transmission pointed vertical. So next, as we're considering our shim size, it's very important to measure the old and the new input shaft from the bottom to the top of the bearing. What we found on this one was the new one was actually a little bit taller from the bottom up to the top of the bearing. So that made us think that maybe the bearing wasn't pressed on all the way, or maybe it's just machined slightly off, because we are dealing small fractions, but it does matter. So this is where you're going to get these two numbers, subtract the new one from the old one, and see what the difference is, and that's how you know which shim you need to use, or how much more or less of a shim you need. And that's where I was disappointed that the shim kit didn't give you increments to make it a difference. It just gave you try this one, try this one, try this one. They're all a little bit different. Now, to pull the race out of the front cover, it's best to pull this out evenly. It can get wedged because of the tight clearance, so pull that out, and underneath the race, we're dealing with the front cover here, this is where you'll find the factory shim. So we're going to go ahead and pull this one out and measure it. And this one came out to 0.90 millimeters. Okay, so with that out of the way, right now we want to clean this out, and we're going to put a new retainer sleeve in. So we flipped the cover back over, and I gave this a few whacks with a weight, and it's in there pretty good because it's pressed. I even just broke the wood. I was trying not to damage the old retainer sleeve in case I ever wanted it, but in the end I had to just give it a good whack. I taped a socket on the front to try to hit that instead of it. But anyway, now we're getting down in here, and we're going to clean this out really well. So once this is clean, and you'll notice the counter shaft is the same. There's a race, and it's going to have a shim under it too, and we're not going to be messing with that one. So we're going to take our 1 3/4 socket here, and now we got our retainer sleeve out of the refrigerator, out of the freezer, and we're going to drop this one right down in. Make sure you have your O-ring. This one actually did not come with an O-ring. I was quite disappointed that they sent it without an O-ring, and I had to get one from Ford. But we're going to put our socket over here, and now we're going to go ahead and whack this down. So you'll hear it bottom out. You are hitting aluminum, so don't hit it too hard, but we just want to make sure that it's flush and that it's even. And so this looks really good, so we're going to move on. We're going to go ahead and install our new input shaft. Okay, so again, we're making sure that blocker ring does not come out. And so we're just going to gently guide this in here and just gently turn it. Okay, again, the counter shaft gear can turn a little bit. It's not going to hurt it as long as you don't have that blocker ring come out. So as you can see, this went in pretty good. We're going to line it up the best that we can. And now we're going to get into the shims. So here's the problem. The kit that I got from Tremec only had a few different shims. It even had duplicates of the same shim, and this is the different ones that they had. And I was a little disappointed it didn't have smaller ones so that you could mix and match. You basically had to use only one of these shims, and they probably figured that that would put you in range. So we went with the smallest shim possible, and we started with that. It was the 0.75 millimeter. We put it back in. And each time as well, it's a good idea to lube this up with some automatic transmission fluid since you're going to be turning it and it's dry and it's a new bearing. So just keep that in mind as well, just as a tip.
Okay.
And we put the cover back on. So this is what you're going to want to do is try this. You're going to test fit it. You take the best measurements you can to get an idea of where you need to be, but we're going to be putting this cover on several times. Now, just a side note, you have these posts, one on the side and one on the top, and they do need to line up into the cover. You can lift it gently with your finger as you're putting the cover on to line those up, and so you're going to want to do that. Now, this one got to the point where it was loose, and then once I put the bolts in and torqued them to 25, 26 foot-pounds, it was just a little bit too firm. You basically have to start over again. I could not go any lower. Unfortunately, I was already using the smallest shim that they had. And just for kicks, I installed it without any shim at all, and it definitely had some end play. So luckily, it looks like it would be resolved through shimming. I would just have to come up with the right size shim. And again, this kit didn't have anything, so at this point I had to pull the race out again anyway. But when I would torque it down, as you can see, I could not even turn the shaft at all. This is what it looked like not torqued. It still had some play. So my next thought was if the bearing was pushed all the way on. So my friend had a press. I went and gave it just a little bit of pressure, and then installing the cover after that, it actually got really close, almost close enough to where I was satisfied, but it still did feel like it had a little too much resistance on it. Now, I wasn't sure if maybe with the RTV if it would be just perfect or not. I would have to check the end play, so I cleaned both mating surfaces very well for the cover and for the case itself. And the RTV we're using is the Permatex Ultra Gray, which is perfect for this application. And I'll put links to this and the tools in the description as well. But again, just being that it was loose until it was torqued down, I was thinking that maybe the small amount of RTV would also spread that case out just enough to work. So I thought I'd give it a go. So we went ahead and torqued it down. It's 26 to 30 foot-pounds. is basically the rating, and you want to go in the star pattern. And I got this so that you just had the RTV barely coming out the sides. And so I let that cure, and again, it just felt like it was going to be just a little too firm for me. And so I decided to tape it up the same as I did on the 10 spline one, and I put the bolt biter on it with the gauge and gave it a few spins, and I could already tell just by feel that it was probably going to be too tight. And so I spun it anyway. It was a good reference point, and where factory was 1/2 inch pound, this one came in at 1.5 inch pounds. And so we went back through here, pulled off the cover again, and you can see how perfect the RTV cured, so that was good news. But we basically did the process over and over again. I tried pushing this down just a little bit more again on the bearing, having it pressed down just a little bit more, see if, because I was close but not close enough. So went ahead and rotated this, got some good fluid on it.
So now with the bolts in but not torqued, you still have some end play. Torquing it down should get rid of that end play and be perfect.
So I was getting close, but I didn't have the shims to get it perfect, and it still had a little bit too much drag on it. So basically I set up the dial indicator to check the end play, and it had 0. Now the spec is 0 to 2 thousandths, so it's a very small spec, but 0 would be okay, but I think this had, absolutely no play in it at all, which was bad. So I decided that I was also going to get an idea of how it was spinning, so I drew a line on the top of it and gave it the little hand test as well, and it definitely still just felt like it was a little bit too firm, and I was afraid that I might burn up a bearing by having it too tight. Now, my first thought was my carrier shims for when I built the 8.8 inch in the Mach 1 when I did the gears, because it has all different sizes. And I opened the box and thought, they're too big, so it's not going to work. But after talking with TIC Performance, they were really nice over the phone. They mentioned the same thing, and I said I was even going down that road. So we pulled them out and basically pulled the cover off again, scraped the RTV. So, don't be too upset if you have to do this a few times to get it right. So we took the race that goes in that input shaft bearing that's in the cover, and we just put it over the shim for the 8.8 gears. And so sure enough, the inner diameter is exactly the same, so you don't have to trim that. That's nice. We only have to draw a line around that outside, or even using a shim, and just trace the outer side, and then all we have to do is bring in some aviation snips and start cutting. And so these worked really well. They even had little perforated teeth, so it cut a very nice pattern as it was cutting. And so we just trimmed it up, as you can see here, and got it as smooth as we could. And we did this with a few different size shims that we wanted, and just got it so that they would basically just drop right down in there. So with that said, I also drew the thickness of these on each one, so I knew what I was dealing with, and looking at different combinations to get me closer to where I was calculating I would need, coming from the .90 shim and judging the difference of the new pinion. You could also see some gunk down in here on the cover, so again, this is a good time when it's off to get some compressed air and blow this out. So I took my air compressor and cleaned that up, and I even tried different shim combinations and numbered them and saw the different sizes until I got it as close as I can. Now, even with this, you won't be able to get it completely perfect. You're going to just have to get it as close as you can that you're comfortable with, and take your measurements when you're done. So I cut up the different sizes, I put them in at different combinations, and I tried bolting it down. And so after dropping these in, you just put the race back down over it. Okay, so that drops down into place. Now we got our cover cleaned up again, and we're going to test fit it. I got it to where I was pretty happy, so I went ahead with another tube of RTV and some more liquid on the bearings, and I put the cover back together. So again, remember, on this cover, it's 26 to 30 foot-pounds and going in the star pattern, and so that's when you want to check the end plays, after it's good and tight. So we put the dial indicator back on it, and remember, the end play is pushing it in and out, not side to side. So pulling this in and out, I was just getting that 1,000th movement, which is about perfect. You want 0 to 2 thousandths is all. Okay, so this was looking really good here, and I was happy enough to try it with the spec. And again, this is after the RTV had cured and the gap was exactly what it was going to be. And you want to take that into consideration because it will move it just slightly, the thickness of the RTV. Okay, so spinning it, it felt really good. I didn't feel a lot of resistance, and so that's what you're going for. You'll definitely be able to feel if it's too tight or not. And so I decided I could bring in my inch-pound indicator here again and go around. So same process that I did before, set it to 0 and gave it some spins. And again, when you're doing this, you're not trying to find a factory preload number. The gears are installed, the gears are turning against each other. The only thing we're referencing this to is how it came out from the factory. And if you wanted to stand the transmission up on its nose, you'd get better readings for this because you have gravity involved. But anyway, we're just trying to get the same numbers that we did from before. So sure enough here, I got it right to half an inch-pound here. And so it looked good. So it felt really good, and I checked with Bowler Transmission. They're very helpful too. Bowler Performance Transmission, they build T-56s all the time and do this. And so along with our end play spec, you also do want it to have just a little bit of wobble, and to me that makes sense as it's trying to go in through the clutch fingers and all that. That would probably be important, so
Okay,
that's
this
probably
is kind
why.
of where we're at now. Spins by a few fingers, so that seems pretty good.
Now, something that had happened earlier in the process I wanted to share is I was getting a little bit of binding in the same spot. So I took the cover off and I drew right where those gears were touching when the binding happened. I stopped the spinning the shaft right there, and I would check in both teeth. And so sure enough, you can see here I found a little piece of microfiber or something that was in those gears. So that's something to check if you're getting any binding. Any aluminum pieces might go down into the bearing and that kind of thing. So just be very careful and keep it clean. So the binding may have been just because the bearing was too tight, but if you do get some binding, that's something to check. Is just stop that shaft right where you're getting the binding and take the cover off. In the end, I was very happy with this, and so this is where I decided to put it back in the car. So as always, thanks for watching. Please check the video description. I have other videos that are similar to this. The Mcleod RXT that goes hand in hand with this install, pivot ball videos coming up. So check the video description and subscribe if you're new.
So this is kind of where
Thanks,
we're at
guys.
now. Spins by a few fingers, so that seems pretty good.